Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, Final Fantasy VIII. One of the more overlooked entries in the franchise, 8 was buried in the glut of fantastic Final Fantasy games that came out in the 90s and early 2000s, starting with Final Fantasy VI in 1994 and ending with Final Fantasy X in 2001. There are a few reasons why it isn't as well remembered, the most important of which being the context of its release. 6 and 7 are two of the greatest games ever made, and they completely redefined the gaming landscape. 6 remains the greatest 2D RPG ever made, and 7 took the world by storm, becoming the series' most iconic entry and one of the landmark games of that exciting era of early 3D gaming. It would have been practically impossible for 8 to live up to the hype generated by its predecessors, and it didn't. This game isn't thought of as bad, it's just not remembered at all. It doesn't help that the storyline is confusing to newcomers, and the complexities of the characters take a long time to fully unravel. Granted, you could say that about a lot of Final Fantasy games, but while 6 and 7 and my beloved 10 immediately make a powerful first impression, it takes 8 more time, and the payoff isn't as great as it is in other games in the series. None of this is to say that 8 isn't a good Final Fantasy game, far from it. It's head and shoulders above the mess that was 13, and I'd put it above a lot of the early Final Fantasy games, and even the smart but occasionally dreary 12. I'm just explaining why it never became as popular as the other games in its series. As it stands, it falls into the valley between the well-known entries, the entries that everyone knows and loves, like 7, 6, and 10, and the lesser-known entries, like 9 or Tactics, that have been given second looks over the last decade and have become the Final Fantasies that quote-unquote the cool people are into. 8 is just there. But it nonetheless deserves credit for two major accomplishments: a fascinating battle system, and the depiction of the first two great romantic relationships in gaming. Talking about the battle system first, it's a fascinating departure from the traditional Final Fantasy battle system. It is extremely experimental. It's the most radical departure since Final Fantasy II, but it never feels gimmicky or overwrought. I would not have minded if later Final Fantasy games had followed its lead. However, a good battle system does not a quality RPG make. Case in point, Final Fantasy X-2. I will have to make a video someday talking about why that game irritates me so, and believe me, it does. In gaming, as in film, literature, drama, and TV, the story and the world and the characters have to excel, or the entire experience falls apart. Final Fantasy VIII does have good characters, but the world is not as compelling as that of better entries in the series, and the story, while emotional, is rather ridiculous. The rampant use of time travel does not help matters. Note to writers, especially Japanese anime and game writers, time travel is not a gimmick. Don't throw it around lightly, or your story will quickly become incomprehensible. Anime and Japanese RPGs are convoluted enough already. If you want to have time travel in your work, make it the main focus, not a cheap add-on. This game introduces time travel as a plot twist in its latter half, and it just does not work at all. I actually don't inherently mind that this game has a convoluted plot, though. I mind that it doesn't make me care enough about that plot or the characters to unravel what's happening. If I care deeply about what's going on and the people involved, I'll figure out the plot, even if it's confusing. But I don't here. I don't care, at least for the most part. I don't care about the politics of this world or the time travel shenanigans. But I do care deeply about the game's two love stories, Rinoa Squall and Rain and Laguna. Let's tackle the former first. It is the focus of the game. If you doubt that, look at the game's logo. Final Fantasy logos are beautiful and distinctive. They're your first impression of what the game will be about before you play it. These can range from the simple yet effective, such as the logo for Final Fantasy IV, to the elaborate and elegant, such as the logos for Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XV. So what's the logo for 8? Squall cradling Rinoa in his arms. If there's a more conspicuous way to indicate right off the bat that this game focuses heavily on the romance between these two, I don't know it. This was a good decision on the part of the developers, and it saves the game from utter mediocrity. This romance keeps the story tethered to Earth, stopping it from completely giving in to the bloated insanity that has swallowed so many promising RPGs. Squall is originally this cold, cynical teenager who doesn't want to get close to anyone. He's afraid of forming connections because he's lost everyone he cares about. When a conversation gets too intense, he changes the topic, saying, whatever. Honestly, he's a much better example of the brooding loner archetype than Cloud from FF7, but by the end of the game he's grown up and become a leader, culminating in a somewhat awkward but quite rousing speech he gives to the Seeds, and a large part of that is because of Rinoa. Naive and compassionate, Rinoa is the opposite of Squall. Born into a family of wealth and power, she has been sheltered her whole life, but she has a strong sense of right and wrong, and she joins a resistance movement against her father, a general. Determined and fearless, she surpasses Squall's expectations, and he finds himself falling for her in spite of himself. From their first dance at the inauguration ball, a truly stunning and beautiful scene even by today's standards, they become essential to one another, though Squall doesn't admit it until later. They're two very different people with very different personalities, but they're both lonely and they're both scared, and they find solace and warmth in one another. I love romances and works, but that also means I'm very critical of them. Watching a Nicholas Sparks movie makes me want to throw up. That's not an exaggeration. Romance is not something to be trifled with. Most games that profess to have romantic elements don't, actually, or else the romance is so cheap and stilted that I'd prefer it disappear into the aether. But not this relationship. It's the real deal. It's not quite as good as Tidus and Yuna's romance in FF10, but it's solid and well-developed nonetheless. However, the romance between Laguna and Rain is even better. Originally, Laguna fell for Julia Hartilly, Rinoa's mother, but circumstances kept them apart. After being injured in combat, he was nursed back to health by Rain. Julia, believing him dead, married a general and had a child, Rinoa. Eventually, the relationship between Laguna and Rain blossomed into romance, and they were engaged by the moonlight. However, when alone, Rain's adopted daughter is kidnapped, Laguna rides off to rescue her. He never sees Rain again. She dies shortly after giving birth to Squall, who never learns Laguna is his father. I love this second romance because it's more than a bond between two teenagers. Though we only learn about this relationship in flashback, it's by far the most compelling part of the game. A fully fledged adult relationship, tinged by tragedy and regret and sorrow, is something that's rare in a Final Fantasy game, or any RPG for that matter, or any video game for that matter. It's a complex romance, started and ended by the ambiguous, fickle, capricious hand of fate. It's exciting and melancholy and heartbreaking. Laguna is my favorite character in Final Fantasy VIII. His has been a life of great triumph, but also great sorrow. Honestly, if these relationships were given more focus, and the whole convoluted time travel plot less, I think this game would have a much better reputation than it does. Games today are much better than those released 20, 30 years ago, because it's not just about the gameplay, it's about why you're engaging with that gameplay. Square figured out in the 90s that an RPG where you're fighting with characters you care about, for the sake of a story you care about, is much more compelling than an RPG that has identical gameplay, that gives you no cause to care about the characters or the story. Art is at its core about relationships. Incredible drama has been derived from relationships between friends and family, and co-workers and comrades. But in the history of art, it pales in comparison to how much drama has been derived from relationships between lovers. And yet, for most of the history of video gaming, romantic relationships have not garnered the focus they deserve. And I'm not talking about banal, damsel and rescuer relationships like Peach and Mario or Zelda and Link. I'm talking about fully realized romantic relationships. The two great romances of this game are the first great romances in the history of gaming, the founders of a tradition that extends not only to Yuna and Tidus in Final Fantasy X, but to Nate and Elena in Uncharted, Chloe and Rachel in Life is Strange Before the Storm, and wow, there aren't as many as I thought. I mean, I could conjure up some more if I were put on the spot about it, but the pickings are slim. We really need to get on that. There are thousands of games about sword-wielding heroes battling ancient evils, yet we can't get more than a handful where there are actual compelling romantic relationships. How is it that we can create worlds made out of cake, but not worlds where there are romantically involved pairings of characters that are in any way compelling or memorable? There are more games where a male hero's wife is dead than games where we get to see him have an actual conversation with her. We've a long way to go. But if we follow the blueprint of Final Fantasy VIII, we can certainly get there. Pretty soon, I'll have done videos on every worthwhile Final Fantasy game ever made. I've already made videos on 6, 7, 10, and 12. I never planned it out this way, but here we are. Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. What I've discovered is that beyond the top tier of franchises, video games have mostly been a wasteland. You go looking through the history of gaming, and you'll find a few gems, but mostly you'll find bad rip-offs and uninspired takes on well-trod genres. This has gotten better recently with the rise of the indie scene, but it's still not ideal. I'll probably wind my way through all the noteworthy Final Fantasy games because, well, they're interesting and worthy of conversation, and a lot of other games aren't. Let's hope we get more games like these. I don't mean Final Fantasy clones, I don't even mean RPGs. I mean games that aren't afraid to take storytelling seriously. Best I can discern, we're heading in that direction, so I hope that continues. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more amazing content. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that romantic stuff. Adios, comrades!